Last 2 weeks we discussed inequality and poverty. They are central to the moral fiber of our collective existence. Fortunately, they are moving in the right direction. Poverty is decreasing, and so is income inequality. But they are not the only issues that demand a reaction from us. They are not the only issues that inform the moral backdrop of our existence. Things like genocides are as well. They trigger a reaction in many of us. We want to come to the rescue of our fellow human beings who may face a terrible ordeal like a genocide, because it denies them agency. It makes them too helpless, and when they are helpless, we wish to intervene. We used to have a name for this. It used to be called humanitarian intervention. Now, admittedly, humanitarian intervention has a checkered history, especially in the 19th century. It was laced with too much of a racist and imperialist undertone. But nowadays, the idea has had a renaissance of sorts, and it's now called responsibility to protect. And our lecturer this week, Gareth Evans, has been very instrumental in the development of this idea, and it's in making it public and winning approval. He's also a distinguished statesman. He was the Foreign Minister of Australia and the President of International Crisis Group, and he's now the President of Australian National University. Here's what he has to say about genocide, other mass atrocities, and responsibility to protect.
What motivated those of us responsible for the conception, the birth, the development of this new concept of the responsibility to protect is really quite simple to describe. Above all, it was a sense of shame. A sense that whatever else we as an international community made a mess of in our response to the problems of the age, don't ever let us make a mess again of our response to genocide and other mass atrocity crimes. The murder, the torture, the starvation, the expulsion, the rape of people for no other reason than their ethnicity, their nationality, their religion, their caste, their class, their ideology. When we say never again in the future, as we've been saying for decades, let's this time, we felt, really mean it. Don't let us ever have to look back again on another Rwanda, another Bosnia, another Srebrenica, another Darfur, and say with that terrible mixture of anger and incomprehension and shame, how could we have let it happen again? So this is what the responsibility to protect, or R2P as we are all now calling it for short, has been trying to achieve. The story that I want to tell today is that we've actually come a very long way over the last decade or so, since 2001, when this new idea was first articulated in the International Convention on Intervention and State Sovereignty, which I was asked by the Canadian government to co-chair with the distinguished Algerian diplomat Mohamed Sahnoun. And then again, when 4 years later, the idea that that commission articulated was unanimously endorsed by more than 150 heads of state and government assembled in the UN at the General Assembly at the time of the UN 60th anniversary for the World Summit. The British historian Martin Gilbert has described the responsibility to protect as the most significant adjustment to sovereignty in 360 years. Well, that's a very big call, but there's a good argument to be made that he was right. To appreciate how far we've come and what's at stake here, it is important to remember where we were just over a decade ago at the beginning of the 1990s. For centuries, all the way back through the course of recorded history, mass atrocities were occurring, and they were a matter really of indifference to everyone else but their victims. The birth of the modern Westphalian system of modern nation states really did no more than institutionalise that indifference in the case of such crimes committed behind state borders. It's not really too much of an exaggeration to say that sovereignty was seen essentially as a licence to kill. The extraordinary thing is how little actually changed, even after the horrors of the Holocaust and the Second World War. Despite the post-war recognition of crimes against humanity in the Nuremberg Tribunal Charter, despite the passage of the Genocide Convention itself in 1948, despite the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the subsequent covenants, despite the new Geneva Conventions on the protection of civilians, and despite even later the end of the Cold War giving new hope for consensus on how to respond to mass atrocity crimes, the decade, and particularly the decade of the 1990s, saw an almost unending series of reminders that the Holocaust of the 1940s, the Cambodian genocide of the 1970s, were not unrepeatable aberrations, and that in dealing with these catastrophes, moreover, the world was really in a consensus-free zone. Even when situations cried out for some kind of response, and the international community did respond through the United Nations, it was too often erratically, incompletely, or counterproductively. As in the debacle of Somalia in 1993, the catastrophe of the Rwandan genocide in 1994, and then the almost unbelievable default just a year later in Bosnia and Srebrenica, when 8,000 men and boys were taken out from under the nose of UN peacekeepers and executed in neighbouring fields. And even when action was taken in Kosovo in 1999, it was in breach of international law because it was taken without Security Council authority because of a threatened Russian veto. Throughout the 1990s, we had, accompanying these catastrophes, a really quite fundamental conceptual gulf being evident between those largely in the global north who rallied behind the cry of humanitarian intervention, the right to intervene, droit d'ingérence in the very influential formulation of Bernard Kouchner. And there were those, on the other hand, in the global south who defended the traditional prerogatives of state sovereignty, arguing that internal events, however horrific, were none of the rest of the world's business. Newly independent states, in particular, very proud of their recently won sovereignty, very conscious in many cases of their fragility, very mindful in many cases of a long history of civilizing so-called interventions by great powers in their regions, were simply very deeply reluctant to embrace the idea that anyone had the right to forcibly intervene in their internal affairs. Their rallying cry became not the right to intervene, humanitarian intervention, it became Article 2.7 of the UN Charter, that nothing shall authorise the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state. That begs the question, of course, as to what is within the domestic jurisdiction of a state, but that's the way that clause was read, and that was the banner that was waved largely by the global south. And so during the 1990s, there was both bitter and divisive debate in the General Assembly and elsewhere, and as a result, an almost complete absence of effective action. Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of the UN, responded to all of this by laying down a challenge in absolutely unequivocal terms when he presented to the General Assembly in the year 2000 his Millennium Report. And what he said is this: if humanitarian intervention is indeed an unacceptable assault on sovereignty, how should we then respond to a Rwanda, to a Srebrenica, to gross and systematic violations of human rights that offend every precept of our common humanity? Well, it was to answer that challenge that the Canadian government established the commission that I referred to on intervention and state sovereignty. And it was in the report of that commission, published in 2001, that Responsibility to Protect, R2P, was born. Our primary task, as we saw it, was to come up with something which built bridges rather than burn down bridges between the global north and the global south, which made clear that there were other response options to mass atrocity crimes other than forcible military intervention, that was not the only game in town, the choice between sending in the Marines and doing nothing at all, and a response which above all was capable of generating a reflex international reaction when these horrible situations came along, that they were everybody's business, not nobody's business, as it tended to be the case for so many decades, for so many centuries. Our report sought to achieve these objectives in four main ways, and I think there were four innovative big things about that Commission report. The first innovation was presentational, to change the language of the debate, to turn the debate hopefully upside down by turning the right to intervene into the responsibility to protect. No longer talk about the right of big states to throw their weight around, rather talk about the responsibility of all states to engage not in intervention but in protection. That's the key theme, looking at it from the victim's perspective, the protection of men, women and children at risk of being murdered or raped or tortured or starved or expelled from their homes. The core motivating idea, I think, behind this linguistic emphasis of the Commission was the Brundtland Commission a few years earlier on the question of environment and development, which came up with the overarching concept of sustainable development, not hitherto part of the familiar language. That language of sustainable development was enough to bring environmentalists and those of a development cast of mind across a common table, able to find common conceptual ground in the way in which they tackled their issues. And that was a model for the idea of really focusing on a new presentational formula which would take people away from their familiar comfort zones and make them think afresh about what the issues actually were. The second thing we did was to broaden the range of relevant actors in the frame, whereas under the humanitarian intervention debate the emphasis had really been wholly on just one class of actor, those international states that were big enough and strong enough to throw their weight around militarily. What we said is that it's much broader than that. For a start, you have to begin with the sovereign state itself and its responsibilities to its own people and to the wider international community, and go from there to recognise the responsibility of states to assist others and the responsibility ultimately, yes, for them to intervene if circumstances really demanded it. One crucial intellectual underpinning for this approach, and in particular putting at least as much emphasis on the sovereign state itself as on those who were charged with responding to horrible things occurring within that state. One crucial underpinning for it was the development of the idea of sovereignty as responsibility by Francis Deng, who was later to become the UN Special Advisor on Genocide. But Francis and his colleagues at the Brookings Institution, especially Roberta Cohen, which were born out of his experience during the 1990s as the UN Secretary General's representative on internally displaced persons. The notion that sovereignty in the post-UN Charter world was not about just control as traditionally conceived, but carried with it obligations to one's own people and the wider international community, was a very important building block. It wasn't the only building block, but it was a very important building block for the R2P, Responsibility to Protect story that we were constructing. The third thing we did in our report was to broaden the range of responses that were perceived as relevant, whereas the right to intervene or humanitarian intervention focused one-dimensionally on military reaction. The responsibility to protect involves in its very conception the idea of multiple elements in the response continuum. You begin with preventive action, both long and short term. You move from there to reaction when prevention fails, as it sometimes unhappily does, even with the best will in the world. And then you move to post-crisis rebuilding, aimed again essentially at prevention, this time prevention of the recurrence of the horror which has occurred. The reaction element in the middle of that spectrum was itself a nuanced continuum, beginning with persuasion and moving from there to non-military forms of coercion of varying degrees of intensity, and only in the most extreme and exceptional circumstances contemplating coercive military force. But the fourth thing we did in our Commission report was to try and clarify what those extreme and exceptional circumstances might be by identifying, for the benefit of policymakers in the Security Council and elsewhere, a set of criteria for the use of coercive military force, which might be applied, particularly by the Security Council, in determining when and how to act. And the 5 guidelines that we identified actually were intended very much to set the bar very high, so that there really was no assumption that it would be anything but very difficult indeed to persuade the world and each other that military intervention was the right course. So the 5 criteria, very briefly, you can see them here. The first is seriousness of harm. Is the threatened harm of a kind and sufficiently clear and serious to justify prima facie the use of force? The threshold test. Then a subjective test, often difficult to apply, but is it clear that the primary purpose of the proposed military action is actually to halt or avert the threats of atrocity crimes in question, whatever other purposes, whatever secondary purposes might be involved? Third, last resort. Has every non-military option for meeting the threat in question been explored with reasonable grounds for believing that other measures will not succeed? It's not a matter of laboriously working your way through, waiting 3 months or 6 months to see where the sanctions bite. It's a matter of making a reasonable judgment that military action is the only thing that's going to stop the horror. Fourth criterion speaks for itself: proportionality, the scale, the duration, the intensity of the proposed military action. Are they the minimum necessary to halt or avert the threat in question? And finally, and very, very importantly, the idea of balance of consequences. Is there a reasonable chance of the military action being proposed actually being successful in meeting the threat in question, but moreover successful in meeting it in a way that doesn't do more harm than good? Is the balance of consequence going to be actually positive, not harmful in net terms? The move from idea in a Commission report to actual real-world implementation was, of course, the next thing that had to happen. Articulated in the way in which we did it in the Commission, the new concept of the responsibility to protect did gain remarkable international traction within a very short time. And when we look back on it now, over a decade later, we can see that this idea had one of the fastest take-ups of any new idea that's ever been really floated in the global arena. Although its initial impact was dulled by the publication of the Commission report, and that's, by the way, what the Commission report looks like, the 90-page volume in 2001, which took the air out of, it was dulled by the 9/11 terrorist assaults, of course, which took the air out of international debate on just about anything but terrorism. Nonetheless, the supporters of the doctrine ground away, and we managed to secure the serious consideration and take-up of this document, of our concept, in 2 important mechanisms that were a prelude to the 2005 World Summit, to which I've already referred. And I'll just mention in briefly the 2 transmission belts without going into any more detail. The high-level panel on threats, challenges and change, which was established by Kofi Annan in 2003 to advise him and the world on the issues that should be addressed in 2005. which I was lucky enough to be a member of, which assisted the process of keeping the idea of responsibility to protect on the agenda, I guess. And then there was Kofi Annan's own report, Enlarger Freedom, which picked up R2P as one of the key recommendations that he wanted to bring forward because he saw it as meeting his own challenge, which he'd been so articulate about back in 2000. So if we move then to what actually happened in 2005, we did see the unanimous endorsement by more than 150 heads of state and government, as I've already said, at the UN General Assembly at the World Summit of this particular concept. And within another year, it had been embraced by the Security Council in a resolution of its own. That this happened, that this language emerged as it did, was anything but inevitable. A fierce rearguard action was actually mounted during the intense 6 months of diplomacy which preceded the 2005 summit. A rearguard action was fought really to the last in the General Assembly by a small group of developing countries, joined by Russia in particular, who basically refused to concede any kind of limitation on the full and untrammeled exercise of state sovereignty, however irresponsible that exercise might be in a particular case. What carried the day at the end was really the persistent advocacy, particularly of the sub-Saharan African countries, led by South Africa, who collectively took the view, which was beginning to be articulated in the founding documents being drafted at this time, and had been drafted in earlier years for the African Union, took the view that the sin of indifference to mass atrocity crimes was worse than the sin of intervention. And importantly, the efforts of the Africans was supplemented by very strong support from a large number of Latin American countries, which was pretty important for them to embrace limited sovereignty principles, given their own historical experience and their long history of reaction against interference from big external powers. In the process of transformation from Commission report to the very complex language, which we'll come to in a moment, of paragraphs 138, 139 of the 2005 Summit Outcome document, and in the course of a process which has actually continued subsequently with a series of reports by the Secretary-General to the General Assembly, largely written by his special advisor, Edward Luck. In the course of this articulation and subsequent evolution, the scope of the responsibility to protect concept was in one important respect narrowed from the way in which it had been articulated in the original Commission report, and in another major respect it was presentationally refined. This has generated some academic criticism to the effect that the original Commission report has been unacceptably diluted, but I don't think that criticism is at all warranted. The narrowing, the so-called narrowing that took place, and it was a narrowing in the language of 138 and 139, was simply a more precise definition of the threshold for the application of the doctrine, whereas the original Commission had talked in terms of a population suffering serious harm, meaning thereby certainly to encompass mass atrocity crimes. We didn't confine the threshold to such specifically articulated crimes, and that's what happened in this particular resolution, where very clearly the trigger had to be genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, or crimes against humanity. All crimes or all concepts which are quite well recognised and understood in international law. Making the threshold triggers narrower but in a sense deeper in this way, I strongly believe made for a stronger, not a weaker, responsibility to protect doctrine. As to the refinement that's taken place, that's really been in the characterisation of the relevant responsibilities in terms of three pillars. Pillar 1, the state's responsibility to protect its own people. Pillar 2, other states' responsibility to assist a state if it's in a mood to be so assisted. And thirdly, Pillar 3, timely and decisive collective action in the case of manifest failure to protect. If we had time to go through it in detail, you'd see the way in which those three pillars are very clearly articulated in the actual language of 138 and 139. The red text is none of this stuff is a triumph of the draftsman's art, but that's the nature of multilateral diplomacy, to produce language that's really quite complex. But the themes come through very clearly. Each individual state has the responsibility to protect its populations from the four crimes. This entails the prevention, and it entails appropriate and necessary means of action. We accept that responsibility and will act in accordance with it. The second pillar, the obligation to assist, emerges clearly from this language in purple here. The international community should, as appropriate, encourage and help states to exercise that responsibility. Again, the international community has responsibility to use appropriate means, peaceful means, to help protect population. And more specifically, we also intend to commit ourselves, as necessary and appropriate, to helping states build capacity to protect their populations from the four crimes and to assist those which are under stress before crises and conflicts break out. Then the third pillar comes up in this green language here. We are prepared to take collective action in a timely and decisive manner through the Security Council in accordance with the Charter, including Chapter 7, the part of the Charter which authorises coercive action, on a case-by-case basis and in cooperation with relevant regional organisations as appropriate, should peaceful means be inadequate and national authorities manifestly fail to protect their populations from genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity and ethnic cleansing. I think again that language and this articulation of the principle in terms of these three pillars, pillars 1, 2, 3, has been extremely helpful in practice in getting the great majority of states to understand and accept the multi-dimensional nature of what's involved in responsibility to protect, and has really given the doctrine greater political force and effect than it would otherwise have had. Well, the birth of a new idea, even its articulation in unanimous General Assembly resolutions, is one thing. The growth to maturity of such an idea and its effective application is something else. Words on UN paper are one thing, implementation is something else. The next 5 years, from 2005 through to the end of 2010, early 2011, a period which I think of as R2P's growth and maturation phase, saw some institutional developments, in particular in the development of early warning and response capability within governments, regional and intergovernmental organisations, some development of civilian, diplomatic and rule of law, for example, support capability, some further development of relevant kinds of military capacities and doctrine, and of course on a separate track the very important development over the last decade of the new institutions of international criminal law, all of which were extremely relevant to the gradual consolidation of the doctrine and creating the circumstances in which it could be practically useful. But overall, the period saw not a lot of effective action and really just a lot of tortured conceptual argument about responsibility to protect, scope and limits, whether and how it should be applied in cases like Darfur, the Congo, Sri Lanka in 2008, response to the cyclone in Burma, Myanmar in that year, Russia's invasion of Georgia around that time. There were debates about all those instances and argument about whether they were or were not responsibility to protect cases and what the appropriate response should be. But not a lot of them generated much action, with the exception of Kenya in 2008. And the particular cover of my book actually captures, I think, better than anything else could, the scale of the horror which the world watched in 2008 or late 2007 in the aftermath of a contested election, when we had the first signs of burning of houses, burning of people inside houses, ethnic cleansing with the movement of some forced movement of some 20 or 30,000 people out of the Rift Valley as a result of the explosion of ethnic violence which was rapidly developing. And that was a situation in which the responsibility to protect concept, the new concept, was actually invoked and was actually translated into some effective action, effective diplomatic action in fact, not military, nothing more robust than that, by Kofi Annan and a team of mediators under the auspices of the UN and the African Union, diffused the situation and demonstrated in the process that even in the most extreme cases, responsibility to protect is not just about military intervention. It was not until 2011 that the Security Council actually itself took action explicitly under the United Nations responsibility to protect banner. But when it did so in the cases of Côte d'Ivoire and Libya, this was widely heralded, including by me, as the coming of age of the responsibility to protect concept. The trouble is the coming of age, the real maturity of the concept, was followed almost immediately by what I think we have to describe as a midlife crisis. The story is one that I guess most people will remember because it's all very recent. In February 2011, Gaddafi's forces responded to the initial peaceful protests against the excesses of his regime, which had been inspired by the Arab Spring demonstrations in Tunisia and Egypt in particular. Gaddafi responded by massacring at least several hundred of his own defenceless people. And that led to unanimous Security Council resolution 1970, which specifically invoked the responsibility to protect concept, which condemned Gaddafi's violence against his civilians, demanded that this stop, and sought to concentrate his mind by applying targeted sanctions, an arms embargo, and the threat of International Criminal Court prosecution for crimes against humanity. As it then became apparent that Gaddafi was not only ignoring that resolution, but actually planning a major assault on the city of Benghazi, in which the opposition forces or ideas and people were concentrated, an assault in which he was saying publicly no mercy or pity would be shown to perceived opponents, armed or otherwise, and in which he used the language of cockroaches, exterminating cockroaches, which was horribly resonant of the language that had been used in the prelude to the genocide in Rwanda in '94. In response to that development, the Security Council followed up its earlier resolution with a second resolution 3 weeks later, also explicitly invoking R2P, which by majority vote, with no Russian or Chinese veto, no dissenting voices at all, there were some abstentions, explicitly authorised all necessary measures, quote unquote, UN speak for military intervention, to, quote, protect civilians and civilian populated areas under threat of attack. Acting under that authorisation, NATO-led forces took immediate action. The feared massacres in Benghazi and elsewhere did not eventuate. If the Security Council had acted remotely as decisively, remotely as robustly back in the 1990s, the 8,000 murdered in Srebrenica, the 800,000 in Rwanda might still be alive today. But the midlife crisis, with the apparent maturity of R2P in the Libya case and almost simultaneously in a similar very effective resolution followed by intervention by French in particular in Côte d'Ivoire in West Africa, with that came a backlash. As the weeks and the months wore on, the Western-led intervention in Libya came under fierce attack from the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, who, in a very interesting foretaste of the kind of structure of the Security Council many of us have argued for as reflecting better the world of the 21st century rather than the middle of the last, all happened to be on, these countries all happened to be on the Security Council at the relevant time. And they attacked the NATO-led interveners and attacked the P3, the permanent three, US, UK and France, members of the Security Council, for exceeding, as they saw it, the narrow civilian protection mandate which had been granted, and attacked them for being content with nothing less than regime change in Libya, which was of course accomplished months later with the overthrow of Gaddafi in October 2011. The trouble was that in responding to the even more rapidly deteriorating and in many ways even more alarming situation in Syria, which broke out towards the middle of 2011, that disagreement over the execution, the implementation of the Libyan mandate translated into paralysis of the Security Council in the face of Syria, with the Council proving itself for months and months and months thereafter unable to agree on anything at all. Not only on the extreme step of military force, military intervention, which not many people, including me, I wasn't arguing for it, nor was anybody else for a whole variety of reasons, but even on lesser coercive measures like targeted sanctions, an arms embargo, or referral to the International Criminal Court. The Security Council was totally silent. Part of the reason for hesitation in Syria is, of course, and certainly the unwillingness to even begin to think about coercive military force, is that the geopolitics of this crisis have been very different from the Libyan one. Complex internal sectarian divisions with potentially explosive regional implications of those divisions. Anxiety about the democratic credentials of many of those, mounting opposition, no Arab League unanimity in favour of tough action, long Russian commitment to the Syrian regime, strong Syrian army, meaning that any conceivable intervention of that kind would be, military kind, would be difficult and bloody. But there is more to it than that. Consensus about how to respond in these cases has simply evaporated in a welter of recrimination about how the Libyan intervention was actually conducted. The recrimination wasn't about the initial military action in the first, or even the first weeks. It was about what happened thereafter, the way in which the NATO-led assault attacked facilities, locations that were of no obvious military significance, like Gaddafi's family compound, the way in which troops were fired upon as they were fleeing from confrontation rather than moving towards it, the way in which one side seemed to be taken in what was rapidly morphing into, as the months went on, a civil war rather than being squarely focused on protection of civilians. But above all, the argument that there were some serious ceasefire offers which should at least have been seriously responded to, not ignored. The P3 are not without answers to these sorts of criticisms, in particular the answer that Gaddafi was still in control of large parts of the country, including around Tripoli, that human rights violations on a terrible scale were still occurring in house-to-house arrests, torture, execution of people, that couldn't be dealt with by a military assault from 30,000 feet from the air, that what you did actually need, if you were going to protect civilians in that sense, was to overturn the whole regime. The trouble is that while these arguments and others like them had force, the permanent three, US, UK, France, in the Security Council really did resist debate on them. They resisted any kind of monitoring, evaluation, debate, discussion about the continued applicability of the original mandate. Now, maybe not all the BRICS countries are to be believed when they say that had better process been followed, more common ground could have been achieved. But I think they can be believed when they say they feel pretty bruised by that experience in the latter days of the Libyan intervention, before it all, of course, finally ended with the actual defeat and overthrow of Gaddafi in October 2011. And I think it is the case that those bruises are somehow going to have to heal before any consensus can be expected on tough responses, at least, to such situations in the future. So what's the future? I think the better news that on the Security Council issue, a way forward has actually opened up with the emergence of an idea promoted initially by Brazil towards the end of 2011, one of the strong opponents of the subsequent Libyan events. The idea that responsibility to protect should be preserved in its entirety, but supplemented by an additional set of principles which they've called responsibility while protecting, or RWP, to match the R2P, And there are two essential elements of this: that before the Security Council decides upon a mandate to use coercive military force in an extreme case, it should systematically work its way through those prudential criteria that were first articulated in the Commission report over a decade ago, but which have not been picked up in any formal way by the international community, and that in particular there should be systematic attention to the criteria of last resort, of proportionality, and of balance of consequences. And the second element in the Brazilian RWP proposal is there should be some kind of monitoring mechanism in the Security Council to ensure that when such a mandate is granted, it is properly subsequently scrutinised, and there is an opportunity to review its continued applicability, its continued appropriateness, or an opportunity to determine whether it should be concluded or amended. So that's the proposal. The initial reaction by the P3 powers to this proposal was very sceptical. These countries would want all these delaying and spoiling tactics options, wouldn't they, was the response. But I think the experience of the Syrian paralysis has led to some gradual rethinking. The reality is that if an unvetoed vote is ever going to be, majority vote is ever going to be secured in the Security Council again, there is going to have to be some kind of consensus on just these issues about the circumstances in which force should be granted, or force of any kind, or coercive measures of any kind should be implemented, and some willingness to allow continuing debate on how the actual process subsequently works. In other words, the concerns that have been expressed by a large swathe of the global south have to be taken seriously, or we're not going to get consensus where it really matters, in the hardest of cases at least, on the Security Council. So let me conclude by saying this. There are bound to be acute frustrations and disappointments and occasions for despair along the way, but that shouldn't for a moment lead us to conclude that the whole responsibility to protect enterprise has been misconceived. There is effectively universal consensus now about the basic principles of the responsibility to protect. And if you're looking for evidence of that, if you're looking for a demonstration of that, you can find it very clearly in the annual debates which have taken place in the UN General Assembly every year since 2009, including the debates which took place at the height of the concern about the perceived overreach in Libya in 2011 and in 2012. You have very clear, confident, enthusiastic endorsement of pillars 1 and 2, perhaps the easier end of the responsibility to protect spectrum, but you've also got very strong support for the principles that are behind pillar 3, because countries do acknowledge that there are going to be circumstances in which preventive strategies and assistance strategies are just not enough to stop some of the horrible carnage that we've seen all too often in the past. Of course, there's going to be disagreement about what to do in particular hard cases. It's in the nature of international affairs that that will be so. But I don't see any walking away from the basic commitment to the principles. What is really, I think, now much better understood by policymakers, even if they're not always acting fully in accordance with that understanding, is that if the Security Council does not find a way now of genuinely cooperating in the future to resolve these hardest of cases, working within the nuanced and multidimensional framework of the responsibility to protect, then the alternative is really going to be a return to the bad old days of Rwanda and Srebrenica and Kosovo. A return, in other words, to either total disastrous inaction in the face of terrible mass atrocity crimes, or alternatively, action being taken to stop them, but without the authorization of the UN Security Council, in breach of the UN Charter and in defiance of every principle of a rule-based international order. I think because these perceptions are alive and well out there, there is plenty of room for optimism that the enormous progress made over the last decade will continue. But we have to be frank about it, there's no doubt that the completely effective, practical implementation of the responsibility to protect norm in every one of its dimensions is going to be work in progress for quite a few years yet to come.
Many of you may be thinking this is one big difficult issue, and you're right. As Gareth Evans suggests, we will be working on deciding what the appropriate modalities of intervention are for many years to come. This is indeed a very difficult issue. Let me make a few additional points. One is that R2P is the result of a new global constellation. It came about because we overcame the traditional separation between North and South and East and West. If they were to continue, we wouldn't get a norm like responsibility to protect. And this is also the case with the International Criminal Court. If countries in Africa and in South America did not support things like the International Criminal Court and responsibility to protect, they would not come into existence. Because they did, we have a new and exciting world. And countries like Brazil, for example, continues to think about responsibility to protect and advocate amendments and reforms to this norm. And one of your readings for this week will be about the Brazilian proposal to United Nations. The second point I wish to make is an idea that is absent in Evans's account, and this is the UN Volunteer Army. This idea is as old as United Nations. Unfortunately, all official UN documents go out of their way to denounce the idea, but it is a stubborn idea, and I think a needed one. So your second reading of the week will be a rare report on this iconoclastic idea. The third point is a question, a nagging question, whether R2P has an inbuilt bias, because Evans writes in his book that we cannot intervene everywhere where there is a justification for intervention should not be a reason to intervene anywhere. That is, we need to accept almost a permanent division in the world between countries that are immune to intervention and countries that are weak enough that we can intervene. And I find this disturbing, because this was the precise permanent division, a two-tier world that we fought against with NPT, right? And should we now accept this? It's a troubling question. But maybe the worst challenge is, even with the best of intentions, whether we will ever be able to know who the good guys are and who the bad guys are in any given conflict, and whether we can reasonably be sure whether intervention will not make things worse. Your third reading for the week is about Rwanda and Congo, and I think you will need to grapple with these issues in that context. And that is your writing assignment for the week. Discuss Congo and discuss whether R2P applies, and if so, how. You have 500 to 1,000 words to make your case. Good luck.